No, I wasn't raised by wolves. And no, I have never been magically transformed into a cat. Welcome to a week in the life of a Gaelic writer. This week I'm talking about some of the strange assumptions that people make about fiction authors, specifically the notion that we are writing about our own experience. But before we get into that, I just want to mention the fact that for a limited time only, I am making Portrait of an Unknown Woman and Other Stories available free on Kobo worldwide and at a reduced price on Amazon of 99 pence in the UK, 99 cents in the US, and equivalent prices in all other territories. So I will link to the various retail sites in the description below the video, and if you want to grab a bargain or a freebie, do it now. I'm doing this to see whether I can shift a few more copies. It might work, it might not. There are all sorts of strategies that people use with price adjustments on Amazon and other ebook sales sites, so this is a little experiment, but now's your chance. So, as I was saying earlier, I wasn't raised by wolves. But I did write a story about a woman who was raised by wolves. I was never magically transformed into a cat, but I wrote a story about that too. If all you write is based on your experience, you're not writing fiction, you're writing memoir. But I have been surprised by the strange questions that some people ask me about what inspires my stories. And I think it's something that doesn't happen with other genres. I'm writing contemporary fiction, literary fiction. I'm not writing romance or erotica or sci-fi or crime thrillers. Well, I am writing a murder mystery at the moment, but until now I haven't been writing in some of these other genres. And I don't think people would ask a fantasy author, have you ever staked a vampire through the heart? Or a sci-fi author, have you ever risen up against the robot overlords who rule a future dystopian world? We accept that everything in those genres is very, very much fiction, and we don't expect that an awful lot of the writer's own life has gone into it. I don't think anyone would ask Val McDermott if she's murdered anyone recently, because we also accept the conceit of the crime novel and we don't expect the authors to have a personal experience of being a criminal. But with literary fiction, particularly if what you're writing is quite realistic, some people think that it must be based quite closely on your life. So when I wrote Iuchar in the New Country, for example, some people asked me whether this was based on my family. It's about a little girl growing up in a refugee family in the New Country, and how she wants to know about what happened in the old country, but there's never really a good time to ask. So she has all sorts of questions, and people wanted to know if this was my experience. No, it's not my experience, it's just a story, it's just made up. On the other hand, I did have a very strange encounter a few years ago with a crazy woman who turned out to be a real menace. When she discovered that I was a writer, she thought that I would be interested in editing her book, which was, well, I'm not quite sure how to categorise it. I think erotic memoir is possibly the closest I could come to it. It was a terrible, terrible book, or at least the manuscript she sent me was awful. And I said to her, this isn't what I do, this isn't a genre I'm familiar with, I can't edit your work, find someone else to do it. But she wouldn't take no for an answer, and she kept on pestering me with emails, and it became very unpleasant for a while. But in a strange way, I made something good out of it, because she, in part, inspired me to write Horse Knocks a How Nice You Are, which is about a woman who creates a social networking app, and it turns into a great commercial success, but then one of her jealous friends gets online and starts to send her all sorts of emails pretending to be other people, and the whole thing gets a bit crazy. So And that sort of thing happens online, this mad woman, and goodness knows, she may have written a beautiful book now with some other editor, but thankfully not with me. I wanted to stay as far away from her as possible. So yes, there are circumstances in which something inspires you to write fiction, but I tend to say that something is inspired by rather than based on, because based on can be too close for comfort, and you don't want people to think that you're writing about them. What I usually find is there's something about a situation or an experience that sparks something, some idea, but then it develops and it runs off in other directions and it becomes the kernel of a brand new idea. Because that's what writing fiction is all about. It's about making stuff up. I wonder why some people ask the crazy questions about the extent to which something that couldn't possibly be my experience is based on my experience. And I think it might come down to the fact that there are some people who just don't really read fiction and who don't really engage with fantasy and made-up stuff in the same way that fiction readers do. Fiction readers take it in their stride, I think, people who read a lot of fiction. And so why would any of these non-fiction readers be reading my books at all? I think in some cases, when I first started writing, people wanted to read a Gaelic book of any kind on any subject. And so some people will read a Gaelic book because they want to read a book in Gaelic, and they might not read a book of that kind in English. So for example, I saw a review of Chusnoch Sahau that someone had written on Amazon, where they said, it's kind of chick litty, but I guess we need all sorts of fiction. Well, yes, that's the point. It's probably not the ideal book for that reader. They were kind about it, and they gave me a high ranking, which was nice of them, thank you. Yes, if it's too chick litty for you and you're not reading chick lit in English, why would you read it in another language? Well, in the case of Gaelic, it's because there just aren't an awful lot of Gaelic books to go around. So if you're keen to read something, then you'll pretty much read anything. I said a minute ago that some of my stories and my characters are not based on, but inspired by real life events and people. And I can think of two cases in particular. I wrote a story which is actually in Portrait of an Unknown Woman, where the character was based on Monica Lewinsky and her affair with President Clinton and the aftermath of that. And I wondered about the ethics of writing a story that was based on an identifiable person, but then I thought, it's a sympathetic portrayal. I've always found her an appealing and a compelling character, and I felt very sorry for her, and that's what I'm trying to portray in the story, that any opportunity she had to live an ordinary, anonymous life was completely taken away from her. Another real-life person who inspired a character that I wrote about, and where, again, I had an ethical question about what I was doing as I portrayed this character in my story, was Charles Taylor, who was the president of Liberia during the 1990s and who was responsible for all sorts of war crimes and atrocities and was eventually convicted on a number of counts at the International Criminal Court. I used some elements of his character and his record in creating my character in the book, but I didn't make it a story about him. And as far as ethical considerations were concerned, I thought, he's a terrible man who did terrible things, and if anything, my concern was that I was portraying my character too sympathetically. I was giving him a degree of humanity which the real Charles Taylor didn't have. But my little story, is he ever going to read it? Is it ever going to bother him? I don't think so. He's serving a life sentence. And in that sense, I thought he's fair game. Monica, I felt sorry for. I wouldn't want her to read that story and think that I was trying to portray her in a negative light. If Taylor ever reads my story, well, good luck to him. He'll probably never read it. you do need to take those things into account. But as I said, in all these cases, the real life situation is only ever the starting point. It's something that sets a hair running and you don't know which way it's going to go. And sometimes you may end up with a story that the reader couldn't associate with the thing that inspired you. So if someone were to ask you, what made you write about this? And if you told them, they'd say, I don't see the connection. But somehow the connection has happened. Does that sound crazy? I don't know. I think if you write fiction, you know that this is how it works, this is how it happens. If you read fiction, you're not going to ask the daft question, but you might be interested in just where the author gets his or her ideas from. I've heard some authors say that's the worst question to be asked. Where do you get your ideas from? And the answer is probably seldom, if ever, from things that happen to me. Things I hear about, yes. Things that happen to me, perhaps, but then they get changed so much that by the time they end up in the book, you wouldn't recognise it. And maybe one day, if I ever do write memoirs, if my life of sitting in my chair with my laptop is interesting enough to write a memoir about, then I'll be writing about my experience. But at the moment, it's all flights of fancy, or it's largely flights of fancy, with perhaps one or two little moments where occasionally we descend from the flight of fancy and glance along the bumpy ground of real life, only to soar up again. Because that's what fiction's all about. It's about things that haven't happened, but maybe they could. Well, except the thing about being magically transformed into a cat. I don't think that could ever happen. It would be interesting if it did, though. Cool, bemisha rashin a Iuchar, the video is a Gaelic, min dúl, agus gus a ficht mir hirshiv, min doch gus go be fear Iuchar, akif ule.